Right, let's go into this story. I think that's fascinating about the Port of Darwin. On the back of last month's cancellation of Victoria's very controversial Belt and Road deal, the Morrison government has now ordered a review of the Port of Darwin's 99-year lease to a Chinese company. Defence officials will advise the National Security Committee of Cabinet whether Land Bridge, which is owned by a Chinese billionaire, should be forced to hand back control of the port. To discuss this and more, I'm joined from Canberra by the political editor of the Australian newspaper, Mr Dennis Shanahan. I've got to say, Dennis, do we even need a review to know this lease is against Australia's national interest? Now, unless, of course, this is about a ruse to give the government some cover to tear it up. Let's hope they do tear it up, exactly like they did with the Victorian Belt and Road deal, Dennis.
Well, I think so. And look, once the government decided it would introduce the legislation which enabled it to repeal the Belt and Road deal, I think the Port of Darwin was the next target. There's no doubt about that. When they did it, there were government members just wanting to cancel the the Darwin Port deal. And I think that what they have done, as they did with the Belt and Road, they've said, here's the legislation. It's not anti-China. It's anti-foreign interest and in our national interest. They went through all of the procedures for the Belt and Road and then cancelled it. Now they're going to go through all the procedures with the Darwin Port, and I suspect they'll do exactly the same and cancel that. There's a number of other issues yet to be looked at, but I think they will. Belt and Road was the first. There'll be more to come.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's also about reducing legal risk, companies coming back at the Commonwealth. But let's hope that's where we end up. Let's look at the other issue too. We're in the offing a week out now from budget. More than 90,000 people, we're told, have come off welfare since the end of JobKeeper in March. Fresh modelling showing a $100 billion boost to the budget bottom line over the forward estimates. But it's not all a cause for celebration. Chris Richardson, I played a grab there, Deloitte Access Economics expert there, warning that the Treasurer will eventually have no choice but to actually cut spending and potentially raise some taxes. We know, Dennis, spending in a crisis is pretty popular, but tightening the belt once you get into the recovery stage, that's tough. And I was there when Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey had a crack at it back in 2013 and 2014. Highly unpopular. Is the PM and the Treasurer up to this task, do you think?
Well, it's a tough task. However, unlike Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey, there is a completely different environment facing Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison. For a start, interest rates are basically zero. Debt is not the great problem it was as far as annual cost to the budget is concerned. And so what we're seeing now is a budget that is not quite a Liberal budget because of all of the changes that have taken place during the COVID pandemic, JobKeeper being the first among those initiatives. And what we've seen, though, is that the dire predictions, the dismal outlooks are not coming to fruition. As Chris Richardson said, everyone was being more pessimistic than they needed to be. And I think that what will come out of this budget is, of course, a very large national debt, a huge budget deficit. But there'll also be the question amongst the public is, yes, there has been a high price to pay, but is it worth the outcome? And if you've got 90,000 people coming off welfare back into work, there'll be a lot of people who'll say the price is right.
And look, to be fair, there's a lot of, the Cabinet, the leadership team, the coalition now, unlike in the past, are actually pulling together. There's no one trying to undermine the Treasury is doing the tough job, or indeed the PM here. So that's another difference than before. I want to pick up a poll today from the Lowy Institute. We've had some in the media refer today to the fact the poll says 1 in 3 Australians think the federal government needs to do more to bring stranded Australians home. But of course, that means 2/3 of the country think the government, the Morrison government, has done enough to get people home. 59%, in fact, are happy with the government's efforts to date. And 95% think Australia's handled the pandemic, they say, quote, very well or fairly well. Now, of course, the big debate relates to these border closures with India, Dennis, and I'm sympathetic, absolutely, to Australians in India and being unable to return for the time being. But I tell you, I've looked at a lot of press coverage across the last 4 or 5 days. There's not much community support at the moment to reopen the borders and bring people back. There's concerns about the rollout of our domestic vaccines. What's your take?
Well, I think that when it comes to polls, in this case, it's a question of a glass 1/3 empty or 2/3 full. Of course, you can read a poll anyway, but what we're looking at, and this backs up the news poll which was taken in The Australian, which found overwhelming support for the way the government is handling the COVID conditions. And I think that most people, demonstrably, will be in favour of keeping the borders shut to keep out a third wave of COVID in Australia. That will be the automatic reaction. There is, of course, a more considered reaction where people say, well, we should be helping our Australian citizens to come home, particularly those who are in mortal danger. Again, the issue is, what do most people think is reasonable? And at the same time, do we put at risk all of our great work by lifting a border restriction, which the health authorities have recommended? I mean, part of the angst about this particular move is the fact that the government has moved to say that people would be jailed or fined for breaching the quarantine procedures.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's the difference. I think that's the difference. But of course, there are a lot of people who have gone overseas for weddings and funerals and other reasons since the outbreak of the pandemic, not prior to the pandemic, but since it's occurred. I think that's where the public sympathy falls away. If you've chosen to go overseas in the last 12 months and you get stuck, people say, you know, you're forewarned and you should be forearmed to come home. Just before we go, I don't want to miss this issue. VILLERS-BRETONNEUX, it's in France. We know there are tens of thousands of Australian dead in war cemeteries in France. There's an Australian memorial at VB, and there's talk now that court decisions in favour of a very large wind farm there. I know a lot of Australians are up in arms. I know people like you, Dennis, and I have been to VB. Many others have as well. There is some debate about what Australians can do to oppose this wind farm. It's been opposed by the French, I might add, but the courts have overruled their own people. Tony Abbott has written to the French president pleading for his intervention. What more can Australia do here, do you think?
Well, look, it is very difficult, and I think Tony Abbott's doing the right thing. And as you say, VILLERS-BRETONNEUX is very important, and it is very important to the French as well. The feeling towards Australia, the positive feeling towards Australia in the region around VILLERS-BRETONNEUX is palpable and it is genuine. Now, this is always a problem when you have what is essentially a sacred site, a burial site, where people from overseas are buried, as is the case at Gallipoli. Now, from time to time, we run into the same problem there, where local authorities in Turkey want to do landfill or change the landscape or do some environmental changes. And so Australia complains, but really, do we have a right to tell other nations what they should do? We can ask them courteously, and we can rely on their goodwill, as is the case in other countries, in PNG, in Singapore, Israel, where all of these sites are. And I think that the French are obviously not happy about this themselves, but we can't really do a great deal to actually impose our wishes on the French company or the French people. All we can do is perhaps trade on the goodwill.
And keep up some public pressure. Dennis Shanahan, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Peter.